with the 2MK team. Today is, as always, Guilty Gear, and we are doing Guilty Gear stuff in our US East Coast PS4 Loser Stays on Lobbies. We are definitely going to see some different action than usual today. But hopefully, we'll be within the realm of our usual. So there are a few things I'll probably repeat as usual. Just to remind players who have not seen these matchups in a while, what our advice on them is. Basic stuff to start. Answer generally wants to get perches above Kai's head if possible. And with a little delay, some mix-ups become available because of where Kai's attack vectors are. He's a little bit linear. It allows Answer to get some good stuff against a character who he can't easily zone otherwise. Kai is looking for every time Answer puts the perches in the wrong position, or that Kai is in motion while they're placed and therefore they're out of position anyway. Since Answer can't move very freely against Kai without them there to help with aerial style mix-ups. Can only throw out occasional damage, but Kai's range in terms of actually counter-attacking is a little bit better. And he can afford to take some damage when he's finally converting into bigger stuff. As long as Kai is able to put the shields in front of himself like that, and Answer cannot therefore react to things as easily, Answer must use his various teleporty counters and purposely triggered teleports to get his positions, like that. Therefore, Answer's goal generally is to set up perches while at mid-range with Kai, and then from there try to take advantage of where Kai wants to move to and what Answer has as stronger options in neutral as a result of those perching positions. When far apart, while it's not really possible to put the perches exactly where you want them, you can use the cards and various other teleport options to lure Kai into thinking it's time to move, and if you manage to place them at the right timing with that, you should still be able to get the same sort of lockdown mix-ups on Kai. Do be aware that while the two characters do have relatively similar length of their normals, Kai's do much better at playing keep out, whereas Answers are more so evasive and will tend to make sure that he doesn't get hit by certain things. Slayer is much easier to lock down as a generality, and Answer doesn't have to deal with a lot of pressure. The key therefore is figuring out exactly where he can get out of it by using his various evasive teleport style moves. And when he can survive by simply putting the perch over his own head, giving him good mix-ups out of his neutral jump game. This is a very precision-based match, understanding when Slayer can make certain actions and when Answer will almost certainly be able to vanish out of them. As we mention every week, Slayer's block strings are very good at setting up further attacks that you cannot counterattack. But that is not Answer's goal, as he is capable of escaping without actually attempting to counterattack Slayer, forcing Slayer to delay a lot of his stuff and shift the situation back. The final part to this matchup is probably the difficulty of figuring out when Answer should move forward so that he does not have most of his perches in front of him. It's not as useful. Even though Slayer is able to play from full screen if he needs to, it's not as easy for Answer to do it, despite the fact that he has good lockdown at those ranges. Slayer's invincible dash gets him quickly toward Answer, and if Answer stays still for too long in that matchup, it's very likely that Slayer will find a way to reach the spot where Answer has very few, well, answers. We see Kai here using his shields to block Answer's air control. And taking away a lot of those same options, which is why the main aim is more so to get it over Kai's head than over Answer's head. It allows for better overall options mid-screen. If you place the one where the closer one to Kai is over his head, but the closer one to Answer is low, you get a couple more options on the ground. Because as you can see, it allows you to maneuver yourself through Kai's shields without having to directly jump. Meaning that Kai must then decide whether or not to throw the shields at the same timing, or try to actually attack Answer's space where he stands, which is probably better for Answer in the long term at least. You see there the other reason. Answer gains the ability to just jump forward, basically empty, land on the perch, and Kai can't be sure what the plan is anymore. This spacing maximizes Answer's attack vectors and minimizes the effect that Kai's shields can have on the match. So now that we've got the basics of those two matches back in our main game plans, of course the advice is to just watch for a bit. If you want to join in, the password to enter the room as well as the ID for the room should be both in our tweet at 2_MK_FGC and available in the stream title. Remember that this is a loser stays on lobby lounge. You can drop to the back at any time if you think you want to think about what just happened. But you are, as of now, we have no requests or obligations for anyone to get off at any point. So if you feel as if you don't know how to play this game at all and want to get to some at least attempts, come on in and quote-unquote hog the station. Perfectly fine with us. Answer's ability to place perches while in the air is a very important part of this matchup, if only because it allows him to spend more time out of Slayer's main attack vectors. The float that he achieves to do that is itself an evasive maneuver against Slayer. While Slayer does have quite a few good approaches for dealing with characters who take up that exact space on the screen, they are not easy to do quickly for most players. And since Answer can also actually do his vanishing teleport counter in the air, you can be baited into attempting stuff against him there. He won't necessarily get any damage from you trying, but you certainly can't say this is going to lead to me be doing big damage if Answer keeps doing that. There are very few things that you can do against Answer that will guarantee you big damage. But as you see here, once Slayer starts to dash with the right timing, it's very difficult for Answer to be absolutely sure how to respond. It's much easier to respond to attacks and space oneself correctly, stay out of the way as you think your position. Dashing is ambiguous enough and powerful enough on Slayer that Answer has to commit to much more less long duration moves, leaving a lot of options open for Slayer's counterattacks. And one counterattack from Slayer can often result in you dying very quickly.
環境保全の観点と公共性維持の両立は課題ですね。差し当たり害獣の対応なのですが、それが絶命。
And of course, our other matchup in question being Kai versus Slayer. Kai versus Slayer is a lot more about push out and understanding when to end your block strings on both characters. Whichever character ends up controlling how far the other is pushed properly tends to have the large advantage in this matchup. So you have to spend a lot of time carefully watching the block strings that your opponent has chosen. And those moments where you could afford to not finish your own. This matchup is a lot less about Slayer's dashing ability, as Kai tends to cover a lot of the space that Slayer dashes into, regardless of whether or not he uses his longer held dash or his short one. However, there are definitely some spaces where Slayer has the option to use the dash rather than a button to get back in if he thinks that Kai has figured out what button he wants to use to counter. When the spacing is uncertain, there's a decent chance that Slayer can at least avoid some damage by doing it. Knowing which dash to use, however, is important. Fortunately, at extremely high levels, because the second touch of the dash is the one that controls how far he goes by whether or not you hold it, you can start off with the intention to dash, and if you are really aware, do a switch midway and dash correctly relative to Kai's action. Unfortunately, this is not a match where Roman cancels do Slayer a lot of good, because for the most part, Kai has a lot of moves that cover his situation well enough that even if you try to Roman cancel through them, nothing in particular is going to happen. You have to have much better execution than one would generally have at this mid-level to make a lot of headway by doing that way.
昔の君は理想論者だった。王たる重責を知った今、どんな答え
And we are back to the grind. Grinders, that is. A lot of dust and crouching dust on both sides.
どい勝負でした。はい、勝ちだ。デュエル2、様子見してんだよ。ここだ。下で本気を見せましょう。ここだ。見えてますよ。これだ。これだ。
文武両道彩色権利、何をやってますギャーってのは勝つ喜びより負ける楽観の方が大きそうだ。メンゴ
剣は習い事ではありません。支障はありません。
恨みっこなしだ。デュエル1、やったれ。そこ
Another thing we're easily be able to see when Answer is fighting in this style is the usefulness of the ability to just dash. Since Kai spends so much time watching the air and being aware of air approaches, as well as teleports, Answer can sometimes just run at Kai without worrying about it. Generally, this isn't something you'd necessarily do in base neutral with no purchase out, but it's still a very real option. Simply because Kai just doesn't have enough time to release projectiles. And burning meter on YRC projectiles against a character who is perfectly willing to stay at mid-screen, lock you down, and similar might not be the best use of your resources as a primary plan. Slayer has similar problems with his various dandy step approaches, and that's why he must spend a lot more time using his dash in this matchup. Part of understanding these anime-style games is to understand that the entire aesthetic is also the concept of why the game plays that way. There usually is supposed to be a lot of dynamic motion, range of movement, stuff you would see in the same sort of anime show. Therefore, you shouldn't generally think of it as a game where your first option is blocking. You probably have another option. There are obviously some times when you don't. The majority of situations in this game are solved more so by moving out of the way rather than blocking the attack. Or at least blocking the attack for a long time. Not every character can do this, but assuming if you're an anime fan, you generally can look at the characters and have a good idea who's going to stand there and take hits. And who you should be expecting to flicker about the place. Part of what makes Guilty Gear fun to watch at basically any level As soon as the player understands that moving around is the way to do this, the game tends to become interesting in its own way. Even if you don't know what you're doing, you can still watch it like that. This matchup is the matchup where Slayer basically gains the most possible advantage from using Dandy Step stuff. Axel's reactions to this don't tend to get him out of the way of the attack quickly enough that Slayer won't have some good damage coming out of it. Since Slayer is invincible for a large part of those, and the move is itself a high-low mix-up, the only thing really required is to get the spacing right. Once that's done, Axel has to respect it. When you're too far out, then you get to dash then, because Axel can't respond to that. And a lot of Axel's attacks, relative to Slayer, are telegraphed in the sense that Slayer in particular has a single response. He can dash through basically anything. As opposed to Chip, who, for example, will normally get hit because his teleport takes too long to start up. But once he starts up, he's hard to keep track of enough to hurt. Slayer has the opposite problem. He is quick enough to get away from the attack when it is launched at him mid-screen, but not necessarily quick enough to get to the correct space and finish off the attack before the opponent hits another attack.
したなようだが王道。昔の君は理想。
There we saw the full shift of the tactics in that matchup. Staying quiet at particular points rather than trying to keep the pressure on. And spending a lot more time observing the spaces you get left at after block strings. Similarly, the opponent not just immediately hitting a button to take their turn, because they realize doing so would push them to a disadvantageous situation anyway. A lot of little pauses at the end of pressure, while both players take stock and try to figure out what to do with their time. One of the most difficult parts for this matchup for Answer is recognizing when Kai is going into the air because he intends to make an approach, versus going into the air to put up a grinder shield and therefore put up a defense. There's no easy way to tell between these, and the reactions required for the two are very far apart. One decent option Answer has is to just use his forward heavy slash, because this will bring him closer without having to worry too much about anything else. He also has a more difficult to execute move that can do similar purposes, because Kai has very little options for strong downward attacks in the first place. If he's jumping, chances are you can dash. If you happen to be prepared for the teleport, even better, but he might get away from you in those cases. Whereas with the dash style move, Answer is generally relatively safe and Kai can't do that much about it. This is not a main tactic, however. It's primarily there to prevent Kai from feeling as if just going into the air all the time is a good way to fight. Until you've gotten that out of his head, he has no reason to not do it. So you must give him at least one reason not to go straight into the air at long range every time, so that you can get some options for setting up your own stuff. Answer can also make use of that style of fight against Axel's longer buttons, though he must be relatively aware that it is, like Kai, a mix-up. When Answer hits a low is hit by one of the crouching heavy or Renson startup things from Axel, he has a lot of good options, but only two will get him closer. The first, obviously, if he has perches, to go into the air. Not necessarily to perch on them, but just to jump and get closer. The other is to do his dash style attacks, with the assumption that anything Axel attempts to do will miss him for whatever reason. Axel in turn has 2 to 3 options, depending on the spacing. There's no specific way that either player comes out on top most of the time, but in the long term of the matchup, this increases Answer's options, because it will force Axel to spend more time thinking about the follow-ups for those things, giving Answer time to put down perches in situations where he happens to not have any yet, because Axel has been somewhat distracted. So it's not really about getting one's offense started, but rather understanding that the lockdown relies on making Axel believe that there are other things to think about in the matchup rather than just the lockdown. Once you've gotten there, you probably have a good handle of how to play the style. Slayer also has some good options in this matchup when it comes to dealing with Answer at close range, because his dash can get him to the other side and ready for throws and his other grab quicker than most Answer players would react, and since these things are not defeated by Answer's twitch reactions in basically any case, as well as not being particularly dangerous to Slayer even when Answer is perched on the perch over his head, it's easier to play out that form of the match than it is to try to win in neutral overall. Answer, in turn, is very stressed when it comes to locking down a Slayer that is willing to at least try to get in for the throw, because they can't wait or expect to get their turn at the end of a block string. Slayer has other options, and once they start to utilize those other options, Answer must go on much more of an offensive stretch. Something Slayer is not necessarily good at countering, but he can be good at avoiding it, moving back out of the main position that he was occupying before to be more stressful. The ambiguity of his situation relative to his dashes, in that you can't necessarily see which one he did, or even sometimes for most people what direction he went, means that Answer is not able to control space as cleanly as he does in most matchups. Well, we got to see some strong creativity at the end there. Understanding how to use your meter in this matchup is a lot bigger in terms of the effect it will have than the base strategy tends to be. Since neither player benefits that much from faultless defense, i.e. Glue Lock, in this match, there's a lot more time available for using large amounts of their meter on other things. However, they're also not that likely to use their super moves as you've just seen there, because neither of them have strongly invincible moves that will definitely tend to punish or get to the opponent. You can certainly use them, but Kai will find situations where Answer just teleports out or is just not there. And Answer doesn't have a lot of Kai actions that can react to using his own because Answers are not invincible. Nor are they particularly good combo enders. So understanding how best to use your meter is almost certainly about either Blitz or Roman Cancel. Fortunately for them both, there are definite times in this matchup where the Blitz helps them against the other. As just demonstrated. There are a lot of approaches that Answer would attempt to use that if Kai is spaced correctly, the Blitz will just stop. And since he can see Answer's options coming from so far away, Answer's best bet normally is to just stay on the perch longer while the Blitz plays out. On Answer's side, it's a little more complicated, but Kai does give Answer some timings at mid-range where the feeling is, I should hit a button, but you might as well just Blitz at those places. Now here's a match we didn't get to see when Johnny appeared last week. This match is strange for Answer because putting down perches in this match really isn't to his benefit that much. Or rather, trying to use them isn't. Johnny as a character benefits and relies on the fact that the opponent has to tech in certain ways, as you've just seen there. And they take a certain amount of time to come back down, Johnny prepares the next attack, and all is well. But what happens when there are perches for you to catch on when Johnny's attacking you? This makes it similar to the Slayer matchup where the general aim Answer has is to put the perches above both their heads, but he's not actually supposed to try to use them. And, much like Slayer, it's relatively easy to get out of Johnny's stuff with Answer's teleport stuff. The difficulty being that if the perches are not in place to catch you, you can't necessarily do that much. So that's just a matter of relaxing and understanding that Johnny's damage can be mitigated by the way Answer's flow goes. And, much like Axel, Johnny does have some good responses to Answer going straight into the air or approaching very fast, but most of them don't lead to big damage. There are not a lot of strong conversions from. You'd have to respond with coins, which, while probably able to win the matchup, in fact, if anything, one would suggest that that is the way to take it. For Johnny to just throw out coins when he expects Answer to approach. This also opens him up to a lot of card stuff. Unlike Slayer, who you can see generally doesn't knock Answer high enough for a recovery to end up with the perch being useful. Johnny allows for this quite a lot, and just managing to not have to come back down or time your responses relative to this could probably keep you in at least a decent situation in the match rather than worrying constantly about being comboed for a longer time. The use of meter in this matchup for Answer is a lot easier to understand. Slayer spends a lot of time doing moves and movements that will allow Answer to use his air super. It's very difficult for Slayer to avoid doing this altogether. He functionally can't help it. He ends up spending a massive amount of time in defensive mode if he does not do this. And because he cannot react to answer immediately going into the air because of the super, you actually get to spend a lot more time just not doing it, just having it there in case you need it. This is also helpful if you have trouble executing the super because, depending on how you choose to do this, you can save yourself a lot of heartache. Don't do the ground one because that might cause weird things to happen on the ground. But if you're already in the air, the most likely thing to come out if you don't do it correctly is just something else that's probably useful anyways. Now, as for Answer's use of Blitz in this matchup, the main thing one needs to understand is that a scramble situation is always in Answer's favor. Any situation where Answer has landed too close to Kai to do anything and is not so certain that it will work out, he can Blitz. Therefore, when you don't feel confident in your spacing, when you have gone up or down and shifted yourself, and think, oh, I should probably do something here, that is the Blitz moment. Because it prevents Kai from counterattacking at all, and it's better than both a Roman cancel and anything you could try to do with the meter otherwise. Since Answer is able to spend so much more time in the neutral and in control of the match, he doesn't necessarily need his Blitz to make contact with Kai, he just needs to create a space where Kai can't counterattack, which is relatively easy for him to do with that move, given that most of Kai's counterattacks are slow enough that if he was sure that it was coming, he could just use one of his other options. And Answer is at highest risk when he is not sure whether or not the spacing he engaged Kai from is correct. So the problem is solved by not caring, resolving the situation directly. This is not useful when you know you've done it wrong. When you know that Kai is just going to punish you. That is a waste of your meter at that point, probably. It depends on the Kai. The Kai player's skill in identifying whether or not the situation is favorable to them has a lot more influence on the outcome than the Answer player. But it's still good to have the option when you're just like, oh, I don't know whether or not that was right or not. Let me just defend myself. It also works in situations like that where you don't know whether or not Kai is coming straight at you or not. As before mentioned, he could just throw fireballs or go into the air to do something else. You can move forward in those spaces, but sometimes you're a little too close, or sometimes you're already in the air yourself. If you're already in the air and you see Kai respond by going into the air, when you land, just go for it. With the patch changes to Axel, this matchup changed. Primarily because Axel was forced to poke at Johnny's legs a lot without any benefit before. Johnny's approaches tend to be quite linear and can be countered relatively easily by Axel's higher hits. But being able to cancel his crouch heavy means that Axel now has a reasonable response to a lot of situations that he didn't before. Because he can always cancel crouch heavy into Rensen with basically no downside to him. Your primary care is whether or not Johnny is in the air. But Axel has good responses to this as well. In fact, Johnny's not very effective against Axel if he goes into the air too much, because then Axel gets thrown into the air with him. So functionally, since Johnny has so much trouble approaching and doesn't functionally have a run, Axel simply has too much advantage granted to him by that crouch heavy for Johnny to do particularly well in this matchup in the direct sense anymore. Once the Axel player's defense when under pressure is solid enough, Johnny is basically shut down in the simple sense of the game. However, Johnny has some really obvious options. Once he has enough meter, he can blitz forward. Then he can jump and blitz, which doesn't do anything, but it does resolve the problem entirely. However, attempting to control the space is a problem for Johnny because that crouch heavy being cancelable means that he must now decide whether or not to use his meter to green block things. He simply can't get in without using coins, and even then the chances of him trading or putting himself in some other problem mean that Axel just has too many options. Fortunately, Axel doesn't necessarily build up enough meter to get through this easily, and therefore can't necessarily spend a lot of time saving himself in the few situations where Johnny does get through by Roman cancelling things. And as demonstrated here, once Johnny gets a hit, this is the character's design. Once he gets a hit, you're going to take a lot of damage. He's intended to do this to you. Still, the overall flow of it means that Johnny doesn't have enough ways into doing this without either using the coins and risking the trade, or finding the correct moment to spend a lot of meter on his blitz. Slayer has a similar way of dealing with this matchup, but it's not really about Slayer being able to hit Johnny in neutral. It is more so that Johnny doesn't have the speed required to react to both the long dash and the cape glide. He has to almost always choose between one and the other. Dandy Step is also very useful here. So as you can see, Johnny ends up on the defensive fairly heavily. Slayer's problem is that Johnny is one of the few characters in the game against whom Slayer's main game plan doesn't work. He has enough range and enough timing to just stick out buttons. And the advantage after block string that we talk about so much with Slayer doesn't apply to Johnny. Slayer is the character. Slayer must dash against Johnny's stuff. There's very few options there. Fortunately, Johnny's hit boxes are not actually taking up all the space of his slash. They take up a space near to the end of his slash in most cases for his actual stronger attacks. So it's safe for Slayer to dash through a ton of things that would otherwise seem like pure pressure. This sequence, for example, is completely dashable. It can be hard to adapt because Slayer's game plan shifts from hit button into hitting more buttons to hit button then dash. And understanding this requirement can push on your autopilot and muscle memory fairly heavily. It's one thing to not hit anything, because that's something we see in the Kai matchup all the time. It's another thing to move from a defensive mindset to an offensive mindset and dash immediately in order to try to get more advantage on a character who basically can just hit buttons. It's just not a good idea. This is a matchup in which Slayer has the most possible use at the mid-level of skill for his meter, but at the same time does not have a variety of things to do with it. Slayer has precisely one thing to do with his meter in this matchup, and that is to roam and cancel his jumps. While you can use roam and cancel dashes to get in, the truth is that against Kai, if you're playing correctly, you shouldn't need to roam and cancel the dash. The Kai player would be so twitchy that it would help you get more of it. And since a roam and cancel dash is something you generally decide to do beforehand, you don't really need to think about that. But there, you can see, is a reason to roam and cancel a jump. A roam and cancel jump for Slayer allows you to go into the air without any intention relative to whether or not you're going to dash forward, cape glide, or use any of his other air attacks. And just see what Kai did. If Kai did nothing, you can take one action. If he did something else, you can try to get over his head and so on. There's no specific requirement one way or another for Slayer in that scenario. Whereas at that range, most of Slayer's dashes and good moves will run basically flat on into Kai's post. He can walk forward, but Kai can always walk backwards, throw out fireballs, set up spacings for grinders, and other things that just generally are annoying. So if you want to get away with just walking forward, then you're going to need to throw a little meter at your jump, roam and cancel so that the Kai has to think more. Because as demonstrated, Kai can just use charged electricity. And so turning at the last moment to go in instead of trying to continue the lockdown. Probably a good sign in terms of keeping the player on their toes. In this match, if meter usage comes up, it is much more the answer needs to Roman cancel his jumps. Not because Slayer has specific responses to them, but because it's easier to get yourself into positive positions by doing so. And while Slayer can take very similar approaches to Kai, he also has a myriad of moves that if he were to try to use them instead, unlike Kai, those moves would move Slayer into zones where Answer gets advantage, much like that you just saw. The situation becomes disadvantageous to Slayer if he tries to respond to a lot of things, whereas Kai really can just stick out buttons and catch Answer falling. Therefore, if Answer is able to recognize that it's possible to trick Slayer into responding to something, especially on a jump back, the Roman cancel becomes a strong option. However, this is almost completely a psychological use of it, and therefore, it's only useful when you expect the player to be defending. When they are on offense, you should, as previously mentioned, use the threat of your super to get your jumps. One other thing you can see as part of the reason why we suggest placing Answer's perches lower against Axel is what you just saw. If Axel walks away from them and does not respond in time to Answer going laterally toward him, he's one of the characters who doesn't have a lot of options to counter the follow-up, and is more likely to not only fail to counter it because of the style that most Axel have to play in, but also even if they did manage to counter it, the damage they get is very small. The key, of course, is that once Axel gets enough range, you have to start trying to find a different way to deal with him. So placing your cards and being ready to get your teleports is a large part of the matchup. Figuring out where you want Axel to be standing on the screen and trying to force him to stand there by how you time the placement of your others. Faust can be a difficult character to understand when you first see him. He gives us the feeling of being a Dalsim style character if you play Street Fighter. He gives you the feeling of being a long attack character if you played other games. Tekken, I actually forgot the name of the character in Tekken he's supposed to be like. The thing you must understand the most about Faust is despite the fact that Faust is almost always able to attack you from crouching like that, his defense against lows is not actually that great. So your crouching dust is a strong option against him. If you have a long standing dust, it's another good strong option against him. This is because Faust must move around constantly in order to keep the correct spacing to keep up all this stuff. He tends to push himself out in places where you would not expect, and he can't afford to be pushed out by your own normals. So, Crouching Kick and Crouching Dust have the strong capacity to put Faust in positions where he's not able to keep up his own attack. If your character does not have a good crouching kick to chain into their crouching dust, whatever they can press that has a long range and good pushback is probably your best option. But above all else, understand that as unconventional and confusing as Faust is, he has to move to keep up his pressure, and he has to be good at that movement. So at the mid-level, when the player is not necessarily a Faust master yet, because a Faust master doesn't ever give you the feeling that they need to move. But before they get there, and you're learning what they're capable of, and so are they, poke at Faust's feet to keep him out, and use that solution to get yourself openings to do other things such as jump or be frustrating. But of course understand that you can't necessarily jump right after that, especially if Faust blocks it, because now he's in a defensive position. You need a little pause, you know, just to make sure that he thinks it's his turn again. Your main options in that matchup depend quite heavily on character because of this. Some people are phenomenally good at it due to the length of their lows, and other people have to take some options relative to the longer low move style they have, or they're very quick overheads. A quick overhead is almost as effective because Faust will tend to be crouching, and if he attempts to react by going to the down back block position, the problem is solved. This is, of course, winning more so by taking advantage of your opponent's inability to react in time. But you should still consider it at least a bit, given that you do need to have some way to keep Faust away from you. A good demonstration there, where Answer did use up a ton of blitzes with no real damage, but it did prevent Kai from taking control of the match back, so he doesn't have to worry about it anymore. And since Answer tends to build up a lot more meter than Kai in this matchup, it's easy for him to occasionally just spend some time doing that when he's not confident in the offense that's being put up. So we're back to our game of chicken between the knight and the vampire. Who finds the right moment to stop attacking first? Once we've gotten past that idea of how the neutral and pressure situation should be played, we get to the spacing part of this matchup, which is functionally the same as most other people need to play against Kai. As mentioned, always. In order to hold his defense correctly against most characters, Kai must backdash at least a bit, but you can't get in on him when he does it. Your aim is to find the most advantageous thing you can do for yourself, either repositioning your own spacing, or if you have one of those characters that builds up some resource that they can use, rebuilding said resource. Slayer has no such resources. He has the strongest capacity to chase Kai of the characters that would want to do it. Unless, of course, your reactions are super good, in which case you can probably chase Kai with a lot more characters, but Slayer doesn't require as many good, strong reaction times to manage to chase Kai's backdashes. And because of Kai's spacing at the end of those backdashes, a lot of things that Slayer does are relatively safe to throw out. However, if Kai becomes too aware of the fact that you chase his backdashes too often, he can set up some stuff. So what is Slayer's best option there? As mentioned before, if you're not confident that you can chase Kai with a move because of the range, you can just jump and Roman cancel things. There are a lot of situations in which Kai wants to move away, knows that he has the space to do it, but a quick Roman cancel jump from Slayer will push on the Kai player's reactions enough to make them twitch. And Slayer has a lot of good air movement in terms of avoiding whatever he switches to. Not necessarily for doing damage, but he can definitely keep himself out of trouble. Whether or not you can justify spending meter on Roman cancels just to stay close to Kai depends on your understanding of the opposing player. Kai is not exactly a strong character at getting himself out of the corner. So, you should generally judge this based more on whether or not you can make the Kai give you breathing room, or if you even want it. If you are fighting Kai mid-screen, you may need to make an adjustment, decide whether or not you actually want to do this. But when you are cornered and you have the option, there's a decent chance it's a good plan, just to get out of the corner with nothing else. If you are really devoted to keeping Kai in the corner, but have managed to push yourself out too far, you may want to spend the meter just to make sure you keep him there. To prevent things like that, for example. Slayer should think of tension meter as a lockdown tool against Kai. When the Kai is too slippery and tends to get out of your pressure or the spacing you want them to too often, just view your meter as a way to prevent that. You can see here the effectiveness of Slayer just being able to dash to the other side of Axel immediately. It is a powerful enough tactic that there's really not that much Axel can actually do about it. He can spend more time in the air to counter the situation, and he can shore up his defense to make the situation better for him. But there's no direct answer in Axel's repertoire except to backdash himself, which eventually leads to a bad situation for him. Fortunately for Axel, if he is playing neutral, it's hard for Slayer to set up the correct situation in which dashing is a good idea. It's a rhythmic situation where one understands that the Axel player is no longer hitting buttons and controlling the neutral as heavily, so you now have the chance to dash. Axel in turn is looking for, when should I jump back? When should I hit buttons? When should I backdash? Because Axel can absolutely afford to spend a ton of time moving away from Slayer into the corner. Unlike other characters who have a very strong chance of responding to Axel's stuff by hitting him out of the air, Slayer, while he can do this with certain moves very easily, doesn't respond well to Axel's more potent forward and upward moving things, and he can just get countered. So the Axel player is looking out for his defense, figuring out how to jump back and prevent himself from getting caught in certain things. And Slayer in turn is trying to guard his head and not get too close, as well as finding the right moment to dash through. Because the dash through moment, when he knows the Axel will continue defending, that is the moment that he is most effective against his character. Axel's capacity to keep Slayer at longer ranges means that he really doesn't get to use a lot of his normals in the same way that he gets to use them against other players. I'm so surprised he survived that. This allows you to feel more confident that Axel will hit more buttons rather than just waiting to be pushed out by Slayer's buttons. The fact of always having to worry about Slayer just dashing right to the other side of him, where Axel's responses are just not as quick or effective. Here's another matchup that has been extremely changed by just one fix to Axel. Faust is heavily pushed back by the fact that Axel can just now hit crouch heavy and cancel it. But what Axel is cancelling the crouch heavy into in this matchup is totally different than most. Whereas in nearly every other matchup, Axel is cancelling into Rensen because he wants to keep the situation to himself. In this matchup, he can cancel into both Rashosen, and I forgot the name of the move that makes him go over your head. Faust is relatively weak to both these options, and ends up spaced negatively when faced with them. As you can see there, one of his best options in that situation is to use up the meter to save himself. But to do this, well, obviously he had to get the meter somewhere, which is not really easy to get when Axel is willing to do this to you. So Axel went from having to poke and expect blocking to having effectively mix-ups out of his longest, safest poke, making Faust's job of getting in this matchup literally random, as we're now seeing. Whether or not Faust is effective has almost everything to do with which items happen to come out. It is one of the few things in any fighting game that you can say is actually random. Well, let's see if the same thing pops out this time. Literally. It does not help, of course, that Axel has a good long-standing dust and a lot of options. Fortunately for Faust, Axel is not one of the characters who's strong... Axel is not strong in his jump back against Faust because Faust is one of the characters who can just reach him all the time. And when he reaches Axel in the air, can convert off that. And meteoric finish. Random number generator strikes again. Now, anyone who's been watching us long enough knows that this does not count as an Axel mirror per se, because the two players have completely different game plans. Normally in a mirror match, the fact that both players are trying to do mostly the same thing and occupy mostly the same space means that most people just avoid playing it. But Guilty Gear allows for a lot of creativity, and very different styles mean that you can end up with people who are literally trying to stay in different points of the screen and use different moves. Our Axel in white is normally not trying to control the neutral, but rather willing to allow the opponent to get closer and take them by surprise with other options. Whereas our Axel in blue is basically all space control, and once someone gets close, tends to have a little more trouble making sure that they are placed exactly where it is required. You get smaller combos like that and a bit of pressure or some wake-ups, but nothing to the level of I have an entire plan as to how I'm poking you out of here. This means that it's much more likely for Axel in blue to be hit by overheads, standing dust, and technically even Rashosen at certain ranges. Whereas the Axel in white is more likely to be hit by well-spaced neutral stuff and Roman cancelled, Rensen, similar things like that there. This also means that this isn't so much just the Axel matchup. This is a lot more about understanding the player. In the standard Axel matchup, Baiken's various approaches are used to get into position to do things while countering Axel's space control. In this matchup, Baiken doesn't have that option at all. She has to spend a lot more time doing aerial attacks of all kinds, with the expectation that the opponent is generally not going to be ready for them as much, and is also not going to be controlling space enough to make it a bad idea to do them. More importantly, if they did switch their style to try to counter the air stuff, obviously the point is that Baiken has other good ground approaches in the first place. She isn't a character who is forced to live in that space where she has to keep trying a particular thing. She can be very relaxed and quiet about the whole thing and solve her problems that way. Of course, since this player is also likely to hit shorter buttons and not have as much space control, the damage that is likely to be taken when Baiken does get countered is again smaller. This also allows her to build up more meter than Axel, and therefore when the situation does get dire, to use the Roman cancel to save herself. Her ground approaches therefore lose a lot of their potency in a matchup against an Axel who is more likely to do things like grounded Rashosin and just hit basic normals in mid-range. As you can see here, the more time spent coming in on the ground, the more damage is taken. The aerial approach, while it may involve getting hit, will normally be at a range where it's difficult, if not impossible, for Axel to convert into anything large. And the rest is just understanding what to do with the Roman cancels so that she can choose one of her many good aerial attacks and either cancel her momentum in the air or proceed forward. Kai does not need to do that much different based on this form of the Axel matchup. This is because Kai's approach to the matchup is basically this: set grinders and get in. But Kai is never trying to get close enough in the first place that the strong distinction between the two styles of Axel appears. If anything, Kai has an advantage in this one because it's less likely you'll be taking a lot of damage. However, as you can see there, the occasional overhead style attack forces him to take more movement options and spend a lot less time prepared for things. Meaning that our Axel in this case could use a lot more of their meter on burst style stuff because they haven't done long enough moves to commit to anything else. There should almost always be time to respond to Kai trying to approach, whereas if Axel had been using the other style and in an attack was whiffed, Kai tends to have more time to do what he wants. Kai generally has to be more aggressive in this match as a rule overall when Axel is hitting lighter buttons. He has to be more aggressive about hitting buttons himself rather than trying to find the right timing to get in strategically, because stuff like that will happen. And there are quite a few attacks that Kai does that are avoided by Axel's overheads and other flying attacks, simply because if you're standing at the space where you expect those to be helpful, where you think they would hit, Kai is also at a space where he should probably be hitting something. And there you see Kai's best option for using his meter in this matchup. Specifically this matchup when the Axel is this type of player. Since they're so much more likely to whiff things, but not things that are too likely to hit Kai directly, using the meter to get supers to do longer attacks outright is more helpful. Now, this style of Axel is much more likely to end up avoiding a ton of dashes from Slayer. But they're also much more susceptible to the standard playstyle of Slayer hits buttons and gets to hit more buttons. In order to get out of this on Axel's, that's exactly what you need to do. It's not really a very effective or efficient way of dealing with the situation though. Having enough meter to do that and treat the situation as positive for you relies on a lot of things that Slayer doesn't have any reason to allow to happen. However, there are some good buttons for causing Slayer to end up dashing into them that are just not good for anything else, and which is why they're not normally used. That button in particular is more so for combos. However, it does a phenomenal job of keeping Slayer from dashing, not doing anything else basically. It can also be used offensively, as you just saw there, when Slayer feels as if it's basically his turn. But understanding when you can use that button is a difficult stylistic thing to develop. Slayer obviously still has access to all of his lows and can make it very stressful for you when he uses them. But what do we see in this style of Axel versus Faust? Well, this is technically useful because this style is the stronger style against Faust, just based on autopilot alone. Despite the long range that can be used, the tendency to hit buttons that will attack from close and to go over Faust's head with certain attacks means that Axel is generally in a better situation. The requirement, of course, is to work in both the crouching and standing dust so that you don't get too overwhelmed. On the other hand, one must at least somewhat be willing to hit the crouch heavy, or you're not going to get much done. So while that is not the standard button used for this player's style, Faust makes it a requirement simply because if you don't press it, you're never going to get him to a space where you can do that sort of thing. And of course you must cancel it into stuff that counters him. Being aware of Faust's randomness is equally required. But as you can see, generally, the main styles of Faust that are available are relatively weak to attacks that hit when you are crouch blocking. Once again, because either it will hit because you weren't blocking, or it will hit because you probably were crouch blocking. So, we are back to the mirror. But you can definitely see the flow between the two styles. And of course you can see that playing more aggressively against this style of Axel is itself an Axel option. It's not specifically because there's no way to defend, but knowing that you have a certain amount of time to move freely before the other player will think it is time to hit a button based on their perception of the space where their buttons work. When you play Axel by poking with the shorter buttons, obviously you build up muscle memory over time that says when to hit those buttons. You don't tend to hit them as preemptively, and you don't tend to hit them when the opponent is far away. This allows the other Axel to take that time to get in closer and get some mix-ups started. And Axel has very good anti-Axel mix-ups. This actually also works against the more space-controlled defensive style of Axel, but you can't run, you must jump.
弱いやつってのは強い獲物を欲しがる。
スレイヤーバザーカイさあ楽しもうぜ。
Get up to rock! Get up to burn!
恨みっこなしだ。デュエルワンビア
さあ防ぎた
見えてますよ。
いかがかねさあ防ぎ届けた
見えてますよ。
いかがかねいかがかねいかがかね
As you see demonstrated here, Slayer actually has a lot of ways through Kai's things, if he's prepared enough. Working in the Roman cancel allows him to jump without having to worry about things, and it also opens up situations in which he can just jump without bothering to Roman cancel. The more times you feel confident jumping, the more times you have in a match to recognize when jumping was a good idea and learn that over time. Meaning that you need the Roman cancel less and less because you spend less and less time unsure of where you are going to be. You can use this as a learning process in the game in general. If you have no idea at all otherwise what to do with your Roman cancel, use it to buy you time in any situation that you are unfamiliar with but actually need to learn how to do. Once you have managed to buy yourself some time, you get to build up a repertoire of situations in which you feel comfortable through the use of your Roman cancel just to get experience, if nothing else. It is one of the most stellar parts of Guilty Gear's design that players were effectively given a one-button slow down time so that I can recognize the situation option. You can't overuse it, but you can definitely use it to learn. been a while since our Dizzy was around, but the overall style of dealing with this hasn't changed. Dizzy has some specific options for zoning Slayer out. And Slayer has some very specific options for getting through that zoning, mostly long dashes. As you can see there, most of Dizzy's pressure is only a fearsome thing to Slayer if he doesn't understand what space he's at. The ability to use both dashing and Roman cancel spacing, as well as the dandy step, to just change the entire matchup serves him well in most situations and causes Dizzy to need to spend a lot more time in the air. She's quite good at this, but this is the counter, as you've noted before. If Dizzy is at the right spacing, throwing out the ice sickle is always going to stop Slayer's main approaches. When she is not, much like any other character, neutral jumping to avoid Slayer's main attacks is not only effective for her, but overall a good idea as a whole, given Dizzy's style. She doesn't suffer too much from doing this. Characters like Johnny and Jam lose a lot of their functionality if they jump into the air like that, and have to be more careful about how they respond to Slayer. But Dizzy loses very few real abilities. She keeps the capacity to do most of the same vectors, even if not with the same moves. Baiken, on the other hand, despite having very similar approaches physically to Slayer, doesn't actually suffer as much from the ice sickle because she can just go through it if she needs to. Baiken's problem is that she has to stop a little short when she's attacking Dizzy. Getting too close to Dizzy removes all of Baiken's good options, so she has to find an exact range at which she can launch an attack and have the attack hit at max. Fortunately, our Baiken player is also both our Baiken players are also Bison players, and therefore have a decent understanding of how to space themselves to get that particular outcome. It requires a lot more patience than most other parts of this matchup, but it will pay off eventually. The overall idea being you're not trying to get close to Dizzy, you're trying to get barely in range of your own buttons. This is because Dizzy's responses to Baiken can't be done too early. If you do them too early, Baiken starts to unlock the ability to go through them. And Dizzy does not handle that very well. Therefore, Dizzy spends a lot more time positioning herself carefully so that she doesn't have to deal with that aspect of matchup. Baiken, in turn, can use this to get close enough to launch her longer attacks without being too worried about it. It is a very long match of attrition, because Baiken is mostly spending her time wearing Dizzy down with single hits. If she gets a good conversion into damage, then yes, she can absolutely be terrifying. But the good side of this is that she builds up a lot of meter, allowing her to either Roman cancel when things are out of space, or just super it. Finding those key moments to roam and cancel and get your advantage are what changed this match for you. And the rest of it is just Viking's propensity for getting out of the way of attacks. Always respect Viking's range when you are playing a character who has no latently invincible reversal type moves. Because unlike most characters in most fighting games where their hitboxes do not extend even quite to the end of their limb or attack, for the most part, Viking's hitboxes are slightly beyond the end of whatever object she's hitting you with. Kai's ability to fight this match has a lot more to do with how quickly he can build up meter for Blitz than most of his other options. Dizzy simply has too many options for pushing Kai into positions he doesn't want to be in, and Kai doesn't have a whole lot of good options for stopping her. That sounded way more perverted than I intended it to. Anyway. While Kai cannot directly go through Dizzy's zoning, it is also true that Dizzy can't actually zone Kai that well. Similar to how Ino does it, Kai has a lot of spaces where he can land counter zoning techniques because he has moves that go forward as much. When he finds himself in a situation where he does not feel confident in those, or where he has been knocked down and now must deal with it outright, he can easily use his blitz to control the situation better. It's all about expectations and shifting Dizzy from feeling it is safe to throw out zoning tools or approach. Shift the Dizzy player to the feeling of, you never know when I'm just going to put Blitz in front of you. The eventual result of this is that Dizzy will back herself into the corner fairly easily, even though she's generally so good at getting out. This works because Kai is one of the most capable characters for trying to stop someone getting over his head. He runs in well, he does not care about having to backdash, he has jump back / attacks, and if you are quick enough, he'll probably just reactively Vapor Trust you. This match is similar to the Dizzy match for Viking, but with one caveat. She's not really trying to get into the space to make Axel miserable with normals or even block strings. Viking's general aim against Axel is actually to get into his space and get him to hit buttons while blocking. If Axel refuses to hit buttons, she doesn't really want to hit buttons herself, she wants to throw. That's your general game plan. The reason this game plan works is because Axel knows that he can't just stick out buttons preemptively, even though his buttons are relatively slow. Just like Dizzy, eventually this will cause Viking to just counter and get through. So he has to use very weak attacks to keep her in position, or block. If he just blocks, given that this game has basically frame 1 throws and you can't really get away from Viking, you don't get any other options. When Axel pushes Viking out with buttons, she can then respond with her own longer ones, whereas with Dizzy is trying to get away. So you don't get to hit then. Axel is trying to control space, so Viking does get to. It may seem like a strange tactic to run up to someone and block, but Axel doesn't have a lot of really good options in that situation. Anything that he does that is really effective and capable of doing a lot of damage is also slow enough that the Viking player would not necessarily be able to react to it, but able to understand that the mindset is based around it. Plus, a little green blocking will change that situation, some just defense. All these tiny things will give Viking much more advantage than the little pushback or defense that Axel gets from having that sort of reaction. Therefore, it is generally in his best interest to stay on the ground and block and delay himself a little bit. The Kai matchup is a lot more like the Dizzy matchup, except that Viking doesn't manage to get anything off going through the air, and must be much more creative with her ground approaches. Fortunately, Kai is relatively weak to Viking's claw because he doesn't like being at the space where it puts him. So she can generally be safe by just looking for enough opportunities to throw that out, and blocking when she expects Kai to want to do something about it. That range that Kai has just ended up at is literally Kai's worst range at the mid-level of play. The required reactions and mindset for dealing with being at that exact space without just backdashing and eventually messing yourself up are functionally high-level play. You can stick out buttons, but I'm not absolutely sure that works either because of how good Viking's jump back is. But as you can see, even when Kai blocks that attack, he's still in a position that is functionally terrible for him, and almost completely advantageous to a daring enough Viking. You don't have to do something. In fact, you probably shouldn't do something every time. But it's a real pain for them. As you can see, this is because Kai has a lot of moves that attack directly in front of him, whereas Viking benefits a lot from just jumping straight up and similar things. She can launch more attacks than most characters from that space, and still be pretty sure she's going to get some decent damage or position from those attacks. Once you've gotten the Kai player to jump like this, it's just a matter of finding the right moment to either blitz or use your meter for a full super. She also has some relatively complex execution stuff with her direct attack that will go upward and hit him regardless. So if you're absolutely certain that they will jump, you have the hard read available to you. Kai therefore ends up with the relatively limited options in this matchup because he can't afford to stand and block at the space where Viking can hit him with the claw.
刃に乗せる思いは力。しかし思いに乗せる刃は狂気に過ぎません。足かせのついた刀ではあなたの実力が試るだけですよ。
So once again, it's relatively easy for Baiken to get close to Axel and just not do anything. She then gains the options of either just throwing him or hitting dust. He's more likely to obviously block the dust, but who cares? Baiken's dust attack is also extremely safe in a lot of situations, and Axel is one of the characters against whom it is safest. But as mentioned before, this is similar to Dizzy, but you also can't jump as much. The jump is helpful to keep the opponent on their toes, but not necessarily going to save you. Axel in turn can respond in a really obvious way here, but this doesn't necessarily work out that well because Axel's lows, while they can lead into good things and can lead into knockdowns, don't help him do that much damage when you're using the slower ones. So while Baiken can be hit low, she doesn't really have to block low. She could just afford to stand block and hope that nothing too terrible happens. The key problem with this is that, of course, if you are stand blocking, you're moving away if the Axel chose to do nothing and you can't throw him anymore. There are some other good options there though. This matchup is much more executionally demanding on Baiken than on Kai. However, Baiken doesn't take that much damage for failing the execution. So you spend a lot of time getting tired, but not a lot of time losing because of it and getting frustrated. They're separate concepts. The key to understand is that Kai cannot afford to stand at the space where the claw can hit him. He will move out of the way, or he will stand there long enough to be in danger. It's therefore best to assume that first he will move out of the way, and consider your options for how to pursue him if he does. Since Kai cannot necessarily pressure Baiken when she's using her approach tools, if he is backdashing, she's just free to use them because he thought that she was going to throw the claw. Therefore, there's not a lot of thinking that needs to happen from Baiken's side, it's a lot of execution that needs to happen. And of course, as you can see there, Kai's best option is to just blitz all of it. However, since Baiken is acting at unconventional times, Kai can't really blitz on reaction. So he can end up both wasting a lot of the meter and having to worry about the fact that he could just end up getting himself hurt. And Baiken can hurt a lot. However, the approaching attacks Baiken needs to use to do this, as I mentioned, are executionally difficult. So if you need to fight a Kai fairly often, you should probably make sure to grind out your ability to execute her approaches. For example, if you were going to a tournament and expected to face a lot of Kai, because if you're at a tournament, there tend to be a lot of Kai, you're going to need to have your execution down in order to make any progress if you decide to play this matchup. Because without it, as you can see, you don't tend to get hurt all that badly, but you do tend to have to start over fairly often.
Get up to rock, get up to burn, stand with the fight, ever feel your desire.
君も無粋だね。
お頼み申すお頼み恨みっこなしだデュエルワンやっOne day I
Baiken can somewhat keep up with Slayer's lows, but she's much better at the incredible jump back defense options she has. Slayer has extreme difficulty approaching Baiken and doing any real damage because he only has two options for getting in on her that don't lose to her just jumping back. Fortunately, once she is cornered, things get a little more easy for her. That range you see there is so easy for Baiken to take control of the match from, that Slayer's best option is to just not be there at all and use a lot of Dandy Step to reposition himself. Since Dandy Step has an upward attack option at the end of it, depending on Baiken's timing, Slayer can make use of this. Baiken is therefore then forced to use her dust in neutral or her crouching heavy slash, I believe, to stress Slayer out enough not to Dandy Step. But Dandy Step's invincibility still has at least a chance of getting through her timing. It's more so the spacing that is deciding that situation, because if Slayer is at the right range, he will just go through Baiken's moves. Once that is established, being able to just jump or dash to get his space is sufficient to get him at least somewhat through the match. And Baiken in turn must spend a lot more time hitting low attacks and not jumping. And once she stops jumping, Slayer just needs to find the right opening. This is a fairly damaging and punishing matchup for him because he gets hurt so much for picking the wrong one. But the reward for picking the right one is relatively high as well. There's not a whole lot that Baiken can do other than to just blitz in neutral and hope for the best. At the final stage, it basically just comes back to an Axel style match where Slayer can win by putting pressure on, and instead of finishing that pressure, doing his long dash to the other side. This situation forces Baiken to have more reactions on the ground than she might otherwise want. And open her up to more of Slayer's stuff. It can be a very exciting match, honestly. Both players are always being at least a little bit random, but it's a calculated random, one that you need in order to make this work. It is also one of those matches where Slayer gets maximum use out of using his supers, shifting the situation closer to the standard style of play, where everyone is specifically using all of the tools at their disposal, and that of course makes it interesting to at least most of us. Depending on the player, therefore, Baiken is basically relying on a particular action. If the player is not so good at keeping her in her position, she will be able to get close enough to get throws. If they are very good at this, the chances are that there will be good opportunities for her to just hit dust and it work without having to overthink it. It's in matches like this that one learns to understand the limits of a character with relatively slower buttons. Even though those buttons are very good at keeping everyone away from them, there is still a blatant limit. Understanding how to get in on Axel with Baiken is a chore, but again, if you play Bison in Street Fighter V or similar, you have a fairly good idea of the quote-unquote misery of this sort of thing. The key then is to recognize when Axel has switched to a more offensive mode such as this one, to stop that whole situation from occurring, and then go back to playing standardly or using your counters, because now that opportunity is open to you again. Do remember that the reason Axel doesn't normally play like this against Baiken, because he really could just keep her out, is because she has a lot of good options for going through those things that he does. And every now and again you can just remind him that these options exist. As you can see there demonstrated, sure you can hit Baiken with your crouch moves on Axel, but it just doesn't hurt enough for her to care. It takes a long time to build up the damage required to make Baiken care. Especially since Baiken is the one consistently moving forward and therefore building up very large amounts of meters. Understanding how to get through is a matter of experience and skill and to some extent execution, but you will get your chance to get in if you spend enough time discouraging your opponent from applying all of their space control. The difficulty is in switching mentally from one to the other. This matches, we are back to the more instinctive way for this to work. Baiken can just dodge through a lot of Dizzy stuff and spend more time in the air to resolve her issues. And after that point, she's just trying to get close enough to hit with the tip of her normals. Dizzy, in turn, is much better at keeping Baiken out using the fire shield and the ice stalagmite than anything else. While Baiken is not necessarily susceptible to the ice block that comes out of the ground as an attack, it also prevents her from doing a lot of the things she needs to turn this matchup in her favor. So, simply doing more of that will push Baiken back at the end of strings to the point where she cannot quickly move back to a position to threaten Dizzy. Whereas, as you can see there, getting through the fish is relatively trivial, and the ice sickle will just get dodged. So spike out of the ground, primarily because even if Baiken blocks it, you don't care. She's in the place you want her to be. Mainly away from you. Dizzy at that point can choose whether or not it is in her best interest to go into the air or launch an actual attack, based on how the Baiken player plays as a generality. But Baiken's options become much more limited once Dizzy starts to hit her with ice from the ground. Very few of her options, such as the fish there, the fish basically, as you can see, just gets ignored. Baiken has enough good ways over things to deal with it. This is because, again, from last week, for those who are not aware, characters in this game have different jump heights, and this influences which attacks they can easily get over and which they cannot. As you can see, Baiken actually has a relatively high jump height, and so there are a lot of attacks that would seem as if they should hit, or you expect it to hit because they hit other players or other characters, that she will just go entirely over. Always pay attention to how high your character jumps, so that you know what attack vectors are available to you as a result. But once again, we see Baiken aiming to wear Dizzy down slowly with relatively singular hits, and not aiming for big combo stuff, because if she tries for too many things that lead into big damage, she becomes more zonable, because she's less able to use her mobility to get through the things that Dizzy does. The pressure though. But once again, while Dizzy does control the air and similar spaces very well, high jumping characters, especially heavier characters like Baiken who move forward more when they jump, can give her some problems, because either they are able to jump or pose a threat from the ground, or they can jump or neutral jump, and Dizzy stuff doesn't work at that point. Often they have like a downward attack that also helps. In fact, you can see that demonstrated here. Kai clearly also has the capacity to launch a decent low attack, as well as an attack that pushes him into an actual striking position from off ground. But he also jumps decently high. He just doesn't move forward as much as Baiken does when he jumps. Forcing him to air dash more often and put himself in more positions that she can counter or backdash away from. It is specifically the fact that Kai does not move forward as much when he jumps that causes this situation, because Sin plays very similar to Kai but doesn't have this problem. Not only because of his vault, because Sin also just jumps better, but vault obviously helps a lot as well. Dizzy, on the other hand, has the best option of all. When you watch Dizzy jump, she may not jump as high as many characters, but she can jump more often. Her jump is a little floating, and she does jump fairly high, but the most important thing is that if she really wanted to, she could stay up there for quite a while. This strengthens her ability to zone, because the opponent does not know whether or not they can approach yet. You don't know if Dizzy going up and forward into the air means anything for you, and as you can see, her air dash is phenomenally good. So is the range on her air normals. So Dizzy being at nearly full screen and jumping straight up does not mean that you are safe and won't get hit. Her ability to super jump, basically, and still dash forward like that makes it more and more likely that she will take you by surprise and that you can't just counter zone her by throwing out your own linear fireballs. If Dizzy absolutely wants to keep you out, her ability to neutral jump is part of that, forcing you to spend even more time very far away from her, and opening up her options for when she can use her own blitz to keep you from actually finishing her off. Simply put, you have to cover so much distance that if Dizzy had finished one move and you reacted slowly to the end of that move, you're the one in trouble now. It is to your benefit to try to anticipate at least some of Dizzy's zoning options and use that to figure out where to be on the screen, because if you can't get to mid-screen, you can't confuse a Dizzy player, and a high-level Dizzy player can convert a lot of these stray hits into much bigger damage. But moments like that, where you have jumped upward, started to fall, and then done your air dash, are optimal for you in a lot of situations, because jumping may put you in a dangerous situation, but you can block a lot of Dizzy's air stuff because of how far away she tends to stand when she does it. It's not pressure, it's just meant to stop you from getting to her. Therefore jump, it's fine, it's safe. Let's say. It may not get you in, but depending on what the Dizzy player did, there's at least a chance. This is why Dizzy cares so much about the spacing that she stands at to fire off ice, because if she spaces herself correctly, you lose almost all of your options. You can't land on it and you can't dash past it. You can manage to not get hurt, but that's about it. Dizzy must watch her spacing very carefully. In a way, she's a contrast to Axel, because Axel's zoning and space control are much more about understanding his timing and the opponent's chosen movement times. Dizzy is heavily about understanding spacing and the fact that when you are spaced correctly, the opponent doesn't have any options anyway. Case in point. This makes the matchup between the two kind of complicated because Axel is spending all his time watching for the correct timing, and Dizzy is spending all her time watching for the correct spacing. Each of them can easily become distracted from the key points of the other player's game plan, leading to a lot of scrambly situations. And as is almost customary, the last match on stream of the night. At least it's not on the train this time. I'm on a boat instead. But yes, we'd like to thank the British Transportation Department for yet another Tuesday train. Join us tomorrow for the first looks at Faultbot and possibly me ranting at Capcom, depending. Everyone else seems to have a higher opinion of the character than me at the moment, so we'll see what we can come up with. The initial prototype concept is a little iffy right now. On Thursday, stop by, of course, for our Kame House Lobbies Dragon Ball FighterZ content. And if you were not aware, remember that we changed it from Tuesday because they kept on doing maintenance. So just so you know, that is actually a weekly thing that they do, so seems our decision was right after all. And if you knew enough Japanese to know to check the Bandai Namco JP Twitter, maybe we would have known that before now. On Friday, if I have managed to glean out of the Twitterverse what exactly it is that people think is making Falk so strong, hopefully the bot will be full of things that make Falk strong, and we will have a disc guidance for you, and on Sunday, the release. However, it is entirely possible, given what we've observed so far, that there may not be quite so much a consensus on how Falk should be played, and we might actually end up delaying the release of that bot. Join us next week for Street Fighter Lounge on Monday and another Tuesday train on, obviously, Tuesday. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good night, everyone.